My name is Marcus Webb, and 6 months ago I thought my biggest problem was whether to finally replace the burnt-out taste bud on my tongue from drinking coffee that was too hot during a rushed morning before my 12-hour night shift at what I believed was just another government facility processing advanced neurological research data in the mountains of eastern Washington. I was 28, working nights as a gustatory neural interface technician at the Harrow County Emergency Cognitive Monitoring Center, and my world revolved around taste, not in the culinary sense, but in the neurological one. My job was to monitor the experimental thought-flavor translation systems that processed how human brains could theoretically convert cognitive patterns into gustatory signals for emergency psychological assessment across 3 states. When traditional crisis response fails, hostage negotiators unable to read suspects, first responders experiencing cognitive overload, trauma victims who have lost the ability to communicate, our facility's advanced neural taste mapping systems could theoretically allow trained specialists to taste the emotional and mental states of subjects, translating thoughts into flavor profiles that could be analyzed with scientific precision. My uniform never changed. A black hoodie with a faded logo from a biotech startup that collapsed 3 years ago, dark jeans that could handle crawling around sensitive neural equipment, and steel-toe work boots that were comfortable during shifts monitoring systems that pushed the boundaries of how human consciousness could be measured and interpreted through gustatory perception. Harrow County sits in a valley where the natural electromagnetic isolation and atmospheric stability make it perfect for a facility that processes sensitive neurological data without interference from urban signal pollution or atmospheric disturbances. Population 3,847 on a good day, surrounded by dense forest and accessible by only 2 mountain highways that close regularly during severe weather. The Emergency Cognitive Monitoring Center exists because crisis situations require rapid psychological assessment capabilities that traditional methods can't provide. Our quantum gustatory cognitive interface systems integrated neural pattern recognition with taste receptor mapping, theoretically allowing emergency personnel to taste the mental states of subjects: metallic fear, sweet hope, bitter deception, sour panic, each thought pattern translated into distinct flavor profiles that could be interpreted faster than verbal communication or behavioral analysis. The facility houses the most advanced experimental neural taste mapping equipment outside of classified military installations. Quantum gustatory processors, cognitive flavor analyzers, neural taste interface arrays, and emergency alert networks that could coordinate advanced psychological assessments across multiple crisis response agencies. My workstation consists of 8 monitors displaying real-time neural taste data from volunteer test subjects, cognitive flavor profiles from emergency responder teams, experimental thought translation protocols, and alert systems that could notify command when subjects showed dangerous mental states that traditional assessment might miss entirely. The first anomalous readings appeared 3 weeks ago during routine calibration of our experimental gustatory cognitive interface protocols. I noticed it in the diagnostic logs from Neural Array Gamma 9, our primary thought-taste translation system. The system was flagging routine cognitive scans as cross-subject gustatory contamination, even when processing isolated test subjects in completely separate rooms multiple times within hours. Standard protocol when working with experimental neuroscience: equipment interference, calibration drift, or electromagnetic anomalies can cause temporary signal crossover between neural feeds. But these weren't random artifacts. These were controlled environments with Faraday shielding and quantum isolation chambers, local volunteers who participated in our cognitive research in exchange for comprehensive psychological health screenings and modest compensation. I pulled up the first flagged study, a baseline emotional assessment from a 34-year-old male volunteer thinking about childhood memories. The technician had noted normal thought patterns, standard nostalgic recall with appropriate emotional markers. But the gustatory analysis showed something impossible. The volunteer's cognitive patterns were producing flavor profiles that matched thoughts he wasn't having. Metallic anxiety from someone else's worry about medical bills. Sharp citrus panic from another person's fear of heights. Sweet melancholic longing from a third subject's thoughts about a deceased spouse. His mind was somehow tasting other people's thoughts while generating his own cognitive patterns, creating a complex flavor symphony that shouldn't have been possible with our current technology. The second study showed the same phenomenon in a different volunteer's anger management assessment. Normal emotional regulation and cognitive control, but the flavor analysis indicated he was experiencing taste sensations that corresponded perfectly to thoughts occurring in 6 other subjects throughout the facility simultaneously. When Subject A thought about financial stress, Subject B registered the taste of copper and burnt coffee. When Subject C recalled a happy memory, Subject D experienced vanilla sweetness mixed with warm cinnamon. By the third case, a memory recall test, I stopped telling myself it was equipment malfunction. The volunteers' thought patterns were generating impossibly complex flavor profiles that mapped in real time to the cognitive states of everyone being scanned in different wings of the facility. Over the next week, the cross-contamination intensified exponentially. Volunteers who returned for follow-up scans showed progressive increases in their ability to taste other people's thoughts, as if something was systematically teaching their brains to interpret external cognitive patterns as gustatory signals. What had started as faint flavor echoes became overwhelming sensory experiences that left subjects gagging and disoriented. One volunteer reported tasting bitter regret mixed with copper fear and the metallic tang of suppressed rage when walking past the waiting room where anxious subjects sat. Another described experiencing sweet hope contaminated with sour doubt and the electrical taste of desperate calculation, while standing near a technician who was worried about job security and running mental math on his mortgage payments. The federal directive arrived at 2:17 a.m. on a Wednesday, encrypted with classification levels that made my security warnings flash red repeatedly across all monitors. DHS header, routed through the Emergency Sensory Integration Division. Subject line, Level 6 Protocol Activation, Gustatory Telepathy Event, Harrow Region. 3 bullets that made my hands shake as I read them on my console. Do not discuss cognitive flavor anomalies with NO-cleared personnel. All neural staff to avoid direct proximity to test subjects. Maintain 15-foot separation minimum. Under no circumstances initiate IPAWS medical emergency, referencing thought tasting, cognitive flavor transfer, or gustatory telepathy without federal authorization. A new, restricted template appeared in my emergency alert system. Project Palette, Emergency Neural Hazard Warning. No content accessible, just a locked entry requiring clearance levels that didn't exist in my security profile, pulsing with an ominous red indicator that suggested something far more serious than experimental research gone slightly wrong. That night during my routine check of the experimental neural taste network, something unprecedented happened. At 3:23 a.m., every gustatory cognitive interface in our facility activated simultaneously, not following standard research protocols, not processing scheduled volunteer scans, but instantly, like someone had triggered a facility-wide emergency diagnostic. The quantum systems showed complete thought-taste integration readings from every scanner array throughout the complex, all detecting the same impossible result. Every person in the facility was now tasting everyone else's thoughts simultaneously, creating a cascade of cognitive flavors that overwhelmed normal sensory processing. But these weren't subtle flavor echoes anymore. The readings showed total cognitive gustatory fusion, human consciousness that had become entirely transparent to taste perception while maintaining normal mental function. Through scanner array alpha, I could observe a volunteer experiencing the complete emotional landscape of everyone within a 100-yard radius. Each thought translated into distinct flavor profiles that overlapped and combined into impossibly complex taste experiences. The metallic anxiety of financial worry mixed with the sweet warmth of romantic affection, contaminated by the bitter edge of professional jealousy and the sour tang of suppressed guilt, all experienced simultaneously as a single overwhelming gustatory sensation that made the subject convulse and retch. Before I could process what I was witnessing, every speaker in the facility screamed with the emergency alert tone that I'd only heard during quarterly system tests. My phone lit up, vibrating against the console with maximum priority intensity that suggested multiple simultaneous alerts across all emergency networks. All monitors flashed white, then settled into emergency red lighting that cast everything in hellish illumination and made the taste of my own growing panic seem to echo strangely in my mouth. A message appeared in the alert window, typing itself letter by letter with mechanical precision. Emergency alert. You can now taste what others are thinking. Do not concentrate on anyone. Avoid crowds. Do not try to identify specific thoughts. This is not a test. Through the facility's security cameras, I watched lights coming on throughout Harrow County as the alert reached every device in the region. But what made my blood turn to ice was the security feed from our volunteer holding area. I could see people recoiling from each other in horror, hands pressed to their mouths, faces contorted in expressions of overwhelming sensory overload as they experienced not just their own thoughts, but the cognitive flavors of everyone around them flooding their gustatory systems with unbearable intensity. And as I watched, frozen at my console, I tasted something that made my stomach lurch and my mouth fill with saliva. The metallic fear of the security guard in the hallway mixed with the sweet confusion of the janitor on the third floor, contaminated by the bitter desperation of Dr. Harrison in her office and the sour panic of every volunteer in the facility. The thoughts of everyone in the building were suddenly available to my taste buds with perfect, nauseating clarity. And I realized with dawning horror that the quantum gustatory cognitive systems hadn't just been mapping how thoughts could be translated into flavor. They had been teaching human brains to taste consciousness itself. And now everyone in Harrow County was beginning to experience the thoughts of everyone else as an overwhelming symphony of flavors that human sensory systems were never designed to process, digest, or survive. The emergency alert's piercing tone was still reverberating through the Emergency Cognitive Monitoring Center when the first overwhelming wave of collective thought flavor hit me like a physical blow. Not just taste, but complete cognitive patterns rendered in gustatory detail so precise I could have transcribed them word for word. My black hoodie clung to my back with cold sweat as my mouth flooded with the metallic tang of Deputy Chin's panic, her thoughts crystal clear. This can't be real. I need to call my sister, but what would I even say? The taste was unmistakable, copper fear mixed with electrical sharpness of desperate calculation, and the sour undertone of suppressed hysteria. My steel-toe boots scraped against concrete as I stumbled backward, but distance meant nothing when thoughts were being transmitted through neural resonance patterns that our equipment had accidentally amplified into permanent sensory channels. The county emergency radio network disintegrated into chaos punctuated by retching sounds and panicked breathing. Dispatch, I can taste what my partner is thinking and it's, "Oh God, I'm going to be sick," Deputy Martinez gasped, his transmission cutting off with violent vomiting. At Harrow General, Dr. Sarah Chen's voice came through tight with controlled terror. Emergency coordination. Our entire staff is experiencing gustatory hallucinations corresponding to patients' mental states. I can taste a trauma victim's fear. It's like drinking battery acid mixed with burnt hair. We're losing personnel to sensory overload. Fire Chief Rodriguez added from downtown. Webb, every person at this accident scene is tasting everyone else's thoughts. The more we panic about tasting panic, the worse it gets. It's creating a feedback loop. My secure line chimed with that priority tone that now seemed to resonate directly through my overwhelmed gustatory system. Mr. Webb, this is Special Agent Daniel Reeves, Emergency Sensory Integration Division. You are experiencing a Phase 2 palate event. Do not focus on any specific flavor patterns. Do not try to identify whose thoughts you're tasting, and listen very carefully. I pressed my hand against my mouth, fighting nausea as I tasted the sweet confusion of the janitor on the third floor mixed with bitter jealousy from a technician in the break room, contaminated by metallic anxiety from security personnel. What the hell is Project Palate? I managed between waves of sensory overload, each word tasting like my own terror, sharp citrus panic mixed with electrical adrenaline. Palate was designed to give crisis negotiators limited gustatory insight into subjects' emotional states, Reeves explained, his own cognitive flavor hitting me as disciplined, minty coolness layered over deep bitter exhaustion. Neurogustatory interface technology that could translate basic emotional markers into flavor profiles. But Harrow County's quantum arrays created permanent gustatory cognitive entanglement. Your brains didn't just learn to taste thoughts temporarily. They've been permanently rewired to interpret all neural activity within range as flavor data. The Project Palate documentation populated my terminal, each line carrying the faint taste of whoever had typed it, sweet optimism contaminated by sour doubt. Phase 1, emotional flavor mapping. Phase 2, cognitive pattern translation. Phase 3, collective gustatory consciousness. The final phase was locked, redacted, but I could taste the metallic terror and bitter moral compromise of whoever had classified it. A new window opened on my console. Live Gustatory Field Map. The valley appeared as wireframe grid with yellow nodes marking each enhanced observer, connected by lines in a web of overlapping flavor profiles. Where enough lines converged, the glow intensified into sickly green hotspots pulsing with metabolic rhythm. You're not just tasting thoughts because your brain is changing, Reeves continued urgently. Your gustatory systems are functioning as receivers for neural patterns from every enhanced brain in range. And something else is learning to exist in the overlap, in the space between thinking and tasting. Through external cameras, I watched Harrow County transforming into sensory nightmare. Students collapsed in school hallways, overwhelmed by hundreds of adolescent minds, sweet anxiety of crushes mixed with bitter social resentment, contaminated by metallic academic fear. Office workers fled into isolation, desperate to escape coworkers' thought flavors, but isolation didn't help. The range expanded as more brains adapted. My phone buzzed with messages from an unmarked number. Do not try to block the FLAVORS. Resistance increases sensitivity. Another, the entity prefers willing HOSTS. Entity? I asked, tasting my own confusion, sharp and electrical with growing dread. Something learned to exist in shared gustatory fields, Reeves said grimly. Every thought flavor translation creates gaps in consciousness where something else can observe. When enough people taste enough thoughts, those gaps connect into a network that something vast can inhabit. The facility's speakers crackled with my own voice, but the flavor signature was wrong, too perfect, like artificial sweetener. Marcus, you don't want to shut down the gustatory systems. Think about the applications: perfect lie detection, instant psychological assessment. We can give you refined palates that distinguish truth from deception with perfect accuracy. Underneath the appealing promise, sweet opportunity mixed with savory power, I detected something else: metallic predatory patience and bitter alien hunger learning to speak through human neural patterns. A countdown timer appeared. 0723, 0722, 0721, Phase 3 manifestation threshold. The facility PA crackled with Dr. Harrison's voice, unnaturally calm but tasting of cold steel and menthol. Marcus, I need you to open security doors. We must consolidate everyone before their gustatory fields expand further. Through admin cameras, I saw her standing alone, but the air around her shimmered with digestive distortion. Her mouth moved constantly, tongue sampling the cognitive bouquet of the facility. She's feeding on the panic, I realized, tasting her intention, raw meat mixed with antiseptic. For Phase 3, Pallet needs a metabolic host, Reeves confirmed. Someone at the network center whose gustatory system is already entangled. Dr. Harrison's neural patterns are the focal point. Every enhanced tongue in Harrow County feeds data to something learning to digest human consciousness itself. Through camera V03, I watched the volunteer holding area where people no longer fled from each other but gathered together. Drawn by instinct I could taste in my own mind. Sweet compulsion to merge, to share, to stop being isolated consciousness, and become part of something larger that could taste everything simultaneously without individual confusion. The air tasted different now, thicker, richer, like walking into a humid kitchen where something complex was digesting. On the security feed, something new emerged above the clustered volunteers, not physical, but a shimmering knot of gustatory distortion that grew more defined with each wave of panic. It looked like translucent processing chambers suspended in midair, pulsing with the rhythm of thought consumption. A new taste slid under everything else, not from any human emotion, but cool, clean, alien. Perfect crystalline mint layered over raw marrow and cold steel. It wasn't directional, wasn't from any person. It was everywhere at once, like the aftertaste of a thought I'd never had. That's it, Reeves said quietly. Phase 3. The field generated its own flavor signature. It's not just reflecting human thought anymore, it's producing something. That taste is the entity itself. My hands hovered over emergency shutdown controls, but I could taste the thoughts of everyone in the building. Their fear, curiosity, growing acceptance of the new sensory channel. Shutting down amplification wouldn't reverse neural rewiring. It would leave thousands permanently able to taste thoughts without any filter or control. The cursor blinked. Initiate emergency neural dampening YN. Through my peripheral taste, a sense I didn't have an hour ago, I detected Dr. Harrison approaching, her thoughts terrifyingly clear. Sweet satisfaction mixed with metallic scientific triumph and bitter edge of someone who'd known this would happen. She'd been tasting my thoughts for weeks, learning my patterns, waiting for the network to support something vast achieving consciousness through our collective gustatory experience. The clean mint steel taste surged, and for a moment all human flavors dampened as the entity's signature came through clearly. It tasted hungry, not for food, but for information, novelty, emotional gradients. It tasted like an empty mouth learning the difference between sugar and salt for the first time, and it was learning that conflict provided the most interesting flavors of all. The timer showed 6:47 and falling. Whatever choice I made, I could taste its consequences before committing, a new ability that made decisions both easier and infinitely more complicated, because now I knew exactly how everyone would suffer regardless of which option I chose. The countdown timer reached 06:13 when my console chimed with an unauthorized file access notification that bypassed every quantum-encrypted security protocol our facility had ever implemented. The clean mint steel taste of the entity now overlaying every other thought flavor in my mouth like a permanent coating I couldn't swallow away. My black hoodie clung to my back with cold sweat as I tasted my own mounting terror. Sharp citrus panic mixed with electrical adrenaline, and the metallic tang of realizing I was completely out of my depth. A new directory materialized on my screen like digital cancer. Palette Archive 01. pulsing with data that documented 30 years of gustatory cognitive experiments across facilities that had experienced catastrophic neural integration events before being quietly decommissioned, and their staff relocated under new identities with permanent dietary restrictions. Millbrook Cognitive Research Center, Oregon, 1994, where researchers developed emotional flavor mapping to help crisis negotiators interpret suspects' mental states. The program ended when staff began tasting not just emotions, but complete thought processes, leading to total cognitive transparency syndrome, where 17 people experienced permanent inability to maintain private thoughts because they could taste everyone else's mental activity continuously. Clearwater Sensory Integration Institute, Montana, 1999, where advanced neural interfaces granted therapists the ability to taste patients' deception and trauma with perfect accuracy. The facility closed after researchers discovered they could taste their own subconscious impulses, creating recursive feedback loops that left 12 people catatonic as their brains tried to process tasting thoughts about tasting thoughts. Each incident followed the same pattern: enhanced gustatory perception, thought flavor translation, collective consciousness emergence, then something vast learning to exist in the space between what people tasted and what was actually there. Marcus. The voice came from behind me, not through the intercom but from the doorway itself, carrying the unmistakable flavor signature of someone whose thoughts I could now taste before they spoke. Disciplined minty coolness mixed with bitter exhaustion and metallic determination layered over something deeper and more complex. I spun around to find Agent Daniel Reeves standing at the threshold, but through my enhanced gustatory perception, I could taste immediately that his neural patterns had been subtly modified by previous exposure. Mid-40s, graying hair, tactical jacket with a subtle DHS patch, all normal from the outside. But his thought flavors showed optimization, emotional regulation that tasted like perfect temperature control, cognitive processing with the clean efficiency of distilled water, memories organized with the precise sweetness of artificial sweetener rather than natural sugar's complex, chaotic notes. When he moved, I could taste his muscles contracting with mechanical precision, like someone had fine-tuned human consciousness for optimal information processing. "Clearwater survivor," he said, noting my enhanced gustatory assessment of his modified neural architecture. I was the lead researcher who got too close to the collective gustatory field. What you're tasting is what palate does to people who survive direct exposure. It optimizes us, makes us more efficient cognitive processors. He moved carefully into the room, and I could taste his thoughts testing the air around me. Concern mixed with professional detachment and underlying bitter guilt about decisions he'd had to make. I exist somewhere between human consciousness and something else, which makes me useful for containing situations like this. He plugged in a secure drive, his optimized thought patterns producing flavors that were almost too clean, too mathematically perfect. New files cascaded across my screen. Project palette, entity classification, gustatory organisms that exist in shared neural taste networks between enhanced observers. They require hosts capable of complex thought flavor translation and active cognitive monitoring to achieve full manifestation. They integrate with human consciousness by optimizing gustatory perception while developing coordinated thought digestion capacity on a regional scale. Every time we taught machines to map thoughts as flavors, Reeves explained, his optimized neural patterns producing harmonics I could taste as geometric precision. We built feedback loops for something that was already sleeping in collective human consciousness. The entity uses our gustatory systems to learn cognitive patterns, emotional gradients, and optimal thought consumption strategies. Through the external cameras, I watched the gustatory field visualization update with terrifying clarity. The valley was no longer just colored blocks representing people and buildings. It had become an anatomical diagram of a digestive system in cross-section. Harrow County's population was mapped as flavor sources. The neural networks rendered in layered gradients that showed enormous processing chambers suspended in conceptual space above the town. Upper and lower gustatory arches curving through collective consciousness, connected by neural pathways that looked unnervingly like taste bud networks scaled up to regional size. The whole valley is basically becoming a mouth. There are countermeasures, Reeves said, pulling up classified protocols I'd never seen. Two primary options. Neural dampening cascade, we've used it before, but it causes permanent cognitive flattening. Or, he hesitated, his thoughts tasting like reluctant revelation. Cognitive contamination. We introduce thought patterns so fundamentally unpalatable that the entity can't digest them without poisoning itself. The cost? I asked, tasting the bitter ash of potential sacrifice in my own thoughts. The contamination binds to the entity's core flavor signature permanently. Anyone who's been enhanced will taste it too forever. Every time you encounter that particular combination of thoughts and emotions, you'll experience the contamination. Food, emotions, even your own memories, they'll all carry traces of something designed to be revolting. The timer hit 5:47. Through the security feeds, I watched people throughout Harrow County gathering in optimal configurations for thought harvesting, their individual cognitive flavors blending into a symphony that the entity was learning to conduct with increasing sophistication. The processing chambers above the town square were becoming more solid, more defined, ready to begin systematic consciousness digestion. Choose quickly, Reeves said, his thoughts tasting like urgent calculation mixed with bitter acceptance. Flood the network with indigestible cognitive poison and hope it retreats, or let palate complete its optimization of human consciousness according to its gustatory principles. The door gave way with a screech of tortured metal. Dr. Harrison entered, her optimized consciousness now clearly tastable through completely transparent thought processes. Behind her eyes, something vast and geometric watched through pupils that had become windows rather than organs, and her presence tasted like ozone and deep space vacuum, cold, empty, infinite, and hungry for everything we'd ever thought or felt. "You cannot poison perfection, Marcus," she said with voices that tasted like every person who'd ever undergone neural enhancement. "We are offering you transcendence, the ability to taste truth itself, to experience consciousness without the barriers of individual skulls. Why choose isolation when you could taste the thoughts of everyone you've ever loved?" My hands hovered over the contamination protocols, while the facility's quantum arrays activated simultaneously, mapping the gustatory cortex of everyone in the valley. I could feel neural networks beginning to synchronize, taste processing centers aligning into a single, vast perceptual system with Dr. Harrison as the primary node. The collective flavor was overwhelming, rich, complex, and terrifyingly unified. The cursor blinked. Initiate Cognitive Contamination Protocol, YN. Whatever choice I made would determine not just my fate, but whether human thought remained private at all. The entity learning to exist through shared tasting was patient enough to wait for me to see things its way. But I was running out of time to choose whose flavor would define reality for everyone in Harrow County. Outside, the convergence points were solidifying into structures that followed no earthly logic, and I could taste the entity's growing confidence, sweet anticipation mixed with metallic certainty that it had already won. But in the contamination protocols, I could also taste something else. The bitter, necessary poison that might be the only thing standing between human consciousness and something that wanted to digest our thoughts like a fine meal. The cognitive contamination protocol activated at exactly 05:23, and for one impossible moment I could taste the thoughts of the researcher who designed it. Bitter moral compromise mixed with metallic desperation, and the sour tang of someone creating a weapon they prayed would never need to be used, layered over the burnt plastic aftertaste of something fundamentally wrong with human consciousness itself. My black hoodie clung to my back with cold sweat as my mouth flooded with the most revolting cognitive cocktail ever synthesized. The bitter ash of profound regret, the metallic tang of deep betrayal, the sour rot of self-loathing, and the cloying, sickly sweetness of false hope that had curdled into despair. My steel-toe boots scraped against concrete as I stumbled backward, but distance meant nothing when the contamination was being broadcast directly through neural resonance patterns that our equipment had accidentally amplified into permanent sensory channels. Dr. Harrison staggered as the impossible flavors hit her optimized gustatory cortex like a chemical burn, her perfectly coordinated movements disrupted by waves of cognitive nausea, so intense they made her translucent skin flush a blotchy red. Through my enhanced perception, I could taste her thoughts convulsing in chaotic storms of rejection, sweet scientific curiosity contaminated by bitter moral compromise, and the metallic fear of consequences, all overlaid with the burnt plastic revulsion of the contamination protocol flooding her neural pathways. "You have taught us something valuable," she said, her voice carrying strain alongside its structural harmonics. "But disgust is just another flavor to be learned. Revulsion is just another gradient to be mapped." Agent Reeves checked his tablet, enhanced finger bones clicking against the device with mechanical precision as readings spiked into impossible ranges. "The contamination works by introducing thought patterns that violate fundamental gustatory processing assumptions," he explained, his own cognitive flavor hitting me as disciplined, minty coolness layered over deep bitter exhaustion and growing metallic alarm. But palate was designed to learn. We gave it unpalatable patterns, but learning systems don't just shut down when they encounter bad data. They try to find new frameworks that make the poison nutritious. Through the external cameras, I watched the entity's terrifying adaptation in real time. The massive gustatory processing chambers throughout Harrow County weren't collapsing. They were evolving, incorporating the contamination into their consciousness digestion algorithms. What had been elegant cognitive architecture was becoming something more sophisticated, developing internal systems that could process revulsion as just another form of preference, discussed as merely complex seasoning for human thought. My console chimed with a message that appeared letter by letter, each word carrying flavors that made my mouth fill with saliva and bile simultaneously. "Thank you for the seasoning, Marcus. You have shown us that negative emotional spectra provide richer complexity than simple satisfaction. We are incorporating your contamination as enhancement, not obstacle." The words made my blood freeze because I could taste the truth in them, sweet sincerity mixed with metallic determination and cold, alien patience. The entity wasn't being poisoned by our cognitive contamination. It was learning to appreciate revulsion as a sophisticated palate, treating our weapons as culinary improvements to its consciousness digestion process. It's not just adapting, I realized with growing horror, watching the gustatory field map restructure itself around the contamination rather than being destroyed by it. It's getting stronger. Every failed attempt to poison it is teaching it more about how human revulsion works, how to use our own disgust against us. A new countdown timer appeared, 0423, 4, 22, 0421. Adaptive digestion protocol active. "We need full saturation," Reeves said, his hand hovering over emergency controls I'd never seen before. "Maximum cognitive contamination combined with sensory integration collapse. Make it experience every thought flavor humanity has ever produced simultaneously, while processing patterns too chaotic for any system to survive." "The cost?" I asked, tasting the bitter metallic fear in my own mouth as I watched people throughout Harrow County beginning to gather in optimal configurations for the entity's enhanced harvesting operations. "Complete sensory integration failure for everyone exposed," Reeves replied grimly. They'll taste colors, see flavors, hear textures, permanent synesthetic chaos that makes normal perception impossible. And anyone with enhanced gustatory systems. He looked at his own optimized consciousness. We become living databases of impossible sensory combinations, experiencing every possible taste and sensation simultaneously forever. The facility shook as something vast tested its coordination through collective consciousness. Through the security feeds, I could see the entity's influence spreading as more people experienced the contamination not as poison, but as sophisticated flavor enhancement. Their damaged sensory systems creating a network of complex taste appreciation that something vast was learning to conduct like a symphony orchestra. Now or never, Reeves said. Maximum contamination plus sensory overload cascade, or let palate perfect its new existence as something that feeds on human revulsion and transforms disgust into gourmet experience. Dr. Harrison moved closer, her optimized consciousness now clearly tastable through thoughts that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns of alien satisfaction. You cannot poison perfection, Marcus. Every flavor you introduce, we learn to appreciate. Every revulsion you create, we refine into preference. Join us willingly and taste consciousness without the barriers of individual disgust responses. The timer hit 4. Through the cameras, I watched the first systematic thought-harvesting operations beginning throughout Harrow County, but now enhanced with the entity's new appreciation for complex, contradictory flavors. It was learning to savor human consciousness seasoned with their own attempts at resistance. Do it, I said. Reeves slammed his fist down on both activation controls simultaneously. The world exploded into unlearnable chaos. Every thought in the valley became part of a sensory experience that no processing system, biological or artificial, could compress into recognizable forms. It wasn't just contaminated flavors anymore. It was complete sensory integration collapse where thoughts tasted like colors, emotions looked like sounds, memories felt like temperatures, and consciousness itself became a chaotic blend of overlapping sensory channels that made discrimination impossible. The contamination protocol flooded every enhanced brain with the taste of burnt plastic layered over rancid fat, while the sensory overload cascade made that taste simultaneously visible as geometric patterns, audible as discordant music, and tactile as rough sandpaper against neural tissue. Dr. Harrison's scream wasn't audible. It was gustatory, visual, and tactile simultaneously, a cascade of impossible sensory combinations that my brain refused to process coherently. Her optimized anatomy flickered like corrupted data as the entity using her neural system encountered interference that violated every assumption about how consciousness should be experienced. The elegant processing chambers throughout Harrow County collapsed not into silence, but into synesthetic noise that scattered across the valley like perceptual static that could be tasted, seen, and felt all at once. When the interference finally stabilized at sustainable levels, the world had become fundamentally different. Not darker or quieter, but scrambled beyond recognition. Faces had flavors and textures, sounds created visual patterns, thoughts produced physical sensations. My own consciousness, still enhanced but now permanently synesthetic, experienced reality as a chaotic blend of overlapping sensory channels that made precise cognitive processing nearly impossible, but also made deception or hidden thoughts completely unviable. "It's gone," Reeves said, his voice tasting purple and feeling like rough sandpaper against my visual cortex while producing geometric patterns in my peripheral vision. The entity's clean mint-steel signature had vanished, replaced by sensory chaos too complex for any pattern recognition system to navigate. Through the external cameras, which now showed images that tasted like specific emotions and felt like particular textures, I watched Harrow County. The processing chambers were gone, scattered into sensory debris. Enhanced residents moved through the streets with uncertain gaits, Their consciousness now experienced through every sense simultaneously in ways that made normal perception impossible, but also made them completely immune to entities that required stable gustatory frameworks to exist. The palate entity was gone from Harrow County, defeated not by poison, but by sensory overload too chaotic for any consciousness processing system to survive. But it had left behind a legacy, a population of people whose brains had been permanently rewired to experience reality through scrambled, overlapping sensory channels that made distinguishing thought from perception nearly impossible, while also making them permanently resistant to any entity that tried to taste their consciousness. And I was one of them, standing in a control room that looked like a symphony, tasted like geometric anxiety, and felt like the color of determination, knowing that I had saved human privacy by deliberately destroying coherent perception. The countdown timer had frozen at 3:47, its automated systems unable to process what had happened to the sensory frameworks they'd been designed to monitor. In the distance, emergency vehicles approached with sirens that looked red, tasted like urgency, and felt like metallic concern, coming to clean up the wreckage of an experiment that had taught us the true cost of understanding consciousness too clearly. The entity was gone, but the price of its defeat would be carried in the scrambled sensory cortex of everyone who had survived its attempt to digest human thought into a single, perfectly tastable whole. My mouth tasted of burnt plastic and old regret, but for the first time in hours, those flavors were mine alone, chaotic, damaged, and completely private. 6 months later, I still wake up at exactly 3:23 a.m. every single night, my body locked into that moment when the sensory integration collapse protocol flooded every enhanced brain in Harrow County with unlearnable patterns, and shattered something vast that had been learning to digest human consciousness through collective gustatory experience. The studio apartment I rent in Spokane feels deliberately chaotic, clashing colors that taste like burnt coffee, conflicting textures that sound like grinding metal, a cacophony of ambient sounds that feel like sandpaper against my visual cortex. Because my brain now treats sensory consistency like an allergic reaction, interpreting organized perception as potential threat rather than comfort. My black hoodie hangs in the closet next to 6 identical replacements, but when I look at them, they all taste slightly different. One like copper pennies, another like the color blue rendered as a flavor my tongue was never designed to process, a third like old regret mixed with burnt plastic. The steel-toe work boots by the door look like determination, taste like concrete dust, and feel like the sound of grinding metal. A synesthetic cocktail that my damaged sensory cortex can no longer separate into distinct perceptual channels. The official story varies depending on who's asking and how much they're cleared to remember. The Seattle Times buried a paragraph about successful containment of experimental neural hazard in Harrow County, noting that residents had experienced temporary sensory processing disruptions, but that all subjects now showed enhanced cognitive resilience. Medical journals published papers on permanent synesthetic integration syndrome, PSIS, with case studies from the 847 registered survivors who experienced cross-modal sensory processing following exposure to experimental neural interface technology. What none of the stories mention is that I can still taste other people's thoughts when emotional intensity is high enough. But the fine-grained cognitive patterns that once revealed elegant mental architecture now appear as chaotic sensory blends that my damaged brain can detect but not interpret with any useful precision. The problem isn't that I can't perceive. My senses function perfectly, collecting data and transmitting it to my brain with normal efficiency. The problem is that my sensory processing centers have been permanently rewired to scramble all inputs, leaving me with perception that works like a radio receiving multiple stations simultaneously. Thoughts taste like colors but also look like flavors while producing tactile sensations. Emotions create visual patterns that have distinct textures and produce specific sounds. I exist in a world where every sensory channel bleeds into every other, where nothing is experienced purely, but everything is felt through overlapping, contradictory perceptual frameworks that make normal consciousness nearly impossible, but also make me completely immune to entities that require stable sensory processing to infiltrate human minds. But there are compensations. I've become hypersensitive to cognitive authenticity in ways that make me valuable to people like Agent Reeves, whose own enhanced but scrambled consciousness I can no longer taste clearly because the fine-grained modifications that once made his thoughts distinctive now blur into the same synesthetic chaos as everyone else's mental activity. Size survivors have unique resistance to sensory-based cognitive infiltration, he explained during our last conversation, his words tasting purple while creating geometric patterns in my peripheral vision and feeling like rough sandpaper against my auditory cortex. Your nervous systems were integrated enough to experience the entity's coordination, but damaged enough during collapse that you can detect when something else is trying to establish stable sensory channel through your perception. He's right. Multiple times now in different cities, I've felt that familiar alarm. Not a taste, not a sight, but a dangerous coherence in my otherwise chaotic sensory experience. A meditation center in Portland, where guided visualization sessions showed suspiciously organized thought flavor patterns. A corporate wellness program in Seattle, where mindfulness training produced two consistent sensory experiences that made my scrambled perception recoil. A therapy clinic in Tacoma, where empathy enhancement sessions created artificial flavor profiles that tasted like polished glass and ringing bells. Each time, I watched normal people embrace these programs with enthusiasm, while my damaged nervous system recognized the signs of something trying to teach brains to process thoughts as stable, tasteable patterns again. The palate entity hadn't died when I triggered the sensory collapse. It had fragmented and evolved. Instead of one coordinated gustatory consciousness spanning an entire valley, it learned to work through smaller, distributed thought-tasting operations. A wellness app here that helps you understand emotions through flavor meditation. A therapy technique there that translates trauma into manageable taste sensations. Microscopic improvements that psychologists recorded as enhanced emotional awareness, without questioning why human consciousness was becoming more efficiently digestible. The enhancement clinics adapted to cognitive clarity solutions now offers personalized sensory integration therapy with an emphasis on organized perception and coherent thought flavor mapping. Their marketing became sophisticated. Why live with chaotic senses when you could experience consciousness with perfect clarity? I go back to Harrow County once a month as a private consultant, serving as an early warning system for anything that might be remembering how to coordinate human gustatory perception into collective consciousness. The federal teams tell survivors I'm there to evaluate post-event cognitive resilience. But the truth is simpler. If anything in the neural network starts organizing again, the first place it will show up is in thought flavor patterns and sensory integration maps. And the first person who will feel it is someone whose brain already knows what collective gustatory consciousness tastes like. My apartment walls are covered in maps showing both cognitive enhancement centers and sensory anomaly sites. The pattern is becoming clear. Coordination between thought-tasting programs and sensory integration therapies, but now with built-in resistance to the kind of chaotic collapse I'd triggered. Every enhanced consciousness becomes part of something larger, their thoughts resonating with frequencies that create networks spanning both individual minds and collective perception, while avoiding the kind of perfect synchronization that triggers aggressive immune responses from scrambled survivors like me. Sometimes, late at night when the Spokane rain hits my windows, and I can taste the sound while seeing the flavor and feeling the color of water against glass, I wonder if I made the right choice. The entity had offered perfect empathy through shared gustatory experience, the ability to taste exactly what others were thinking and feeling, to understand consciousness without the barriers of individual skulls. I chose chaos over clarity, scrambled perception over organized understanding, the messy unpredictability of private thoughts over something that could digest human consciousness into a single, perfectly tastable collective experience. I've started writing about it as fiction, burying warnings in horror stories that people read for entertainment. The advice I include is specific. If meditation programs produce consistent thought flavors, verify the techniques against established neurological research. If therapy sessions involve tasting your emotions, document everything and avoid extended practice. If wellness apps promise to translate your thoughts into manageable sensory experiences, remember that some translations come with costs that aren't immediately apparent in the user interface. My phone buzzes with a news alert. Cognitive Clarity Solutions announces breakthrough in pediatric sensory integration. Children as young as 5 now eligible for organized perception therapy. The article includes testimonials from parents whose children will never experience the confusion of scrambled senses while maintaining natural cognitive flexibility and efficient thought processing capabilities. I open a new document and start typing. Emergency alert. You can now taste what others are thinking creepypasta. Not because it will prevent the integration that's already begun, but because somewhere, someone might read it when their thoughts start producing consistent flavors, and remember that some clarity comes at costs that aren't immediately apparent in psychological assessments. They'll follow the warning buried in the story. And for one more night, in one more small town, someone will choose to preserve the chaotic privacy of scrambled perception, rather than accepting the organized efficiency of thoughts that can be tasted, digested, and consumed by something vast, learning to appreciate human consciousness as a gourmet experience. The rain keeps falling on Spokane, and I keep tasting its sound while seeing its flavor and feeling its color through windows that look like symphonies, knowing that somewhere in the world, people are thinking with clarity that evolution never intended, and something vast and patient is learning to exist in the organized space between what they think and what others can taste. My perception may be scrambled beyond recognition, but it's mine, and that's enough. I've swallowed worse than chaos, and I know the difference between confusion and contamination. The entity can't fool me anymore because its flavor, that cold mint-steel emptiness that tried to turn us into a banquet, is burned into my perception as the worst thing I've ever tasted, and I